Nanu. Hello there. This is part 22 of Project 2025, read by Douglas Wayne Ricketts. We are starting with page 273 today of this 920-page PDF, and the section is titled Journalists, Secretary. Agency journalists, both on and off American soil, have faced danger, yet their superiors have done little to protect them. Whistleblowers and Trump administration officials found that protection of U.S. AGM American and foreign journalists employed by U.S. AGM networks and grantee organizations was severely lacking. Against often significant resistance, political appointees forced action to enable broadcasters who were under verified threats to broadcast from remote locations while being protected by federal law enforcement officers. Likewise, political appointees met resistance from senior career officials when insisting that foreign-based journalists in high-risk countries make their locations known to the agency in the event they required rescue, extraction, or safe housing. Such safety measures, argued career officials, would somehow represent a violation of journalistic independence. With only rare exceptions, resistance to the most basic journalist safety measures was the knee-jerk response from U.S. AGM career officials. Wasting taxpayer dollars. The U.S. AGM's current operations, properly managed, can be conducted on less than $700 million per year. Prior to the arrival of President Donald Trump's appointees in June 2020, budgeting, financial responsibility, and spending totaled over $800 million per year, with virtually no oversight or supervision. Waste, unnecessary spending, nepotism for pet projects, redundant programs, and unnecessary hiring abounded. Consolidation and reduction of redundant services. Currently, the U.S. AGM funds numerous redundant services through its own offices, through Voice of America and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and through its grantees. For example, VOA has a Mandarin language service, but also funds redundant services through Radio Free Asia. VOA also has a Farsi language service that duplicates one funded through Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty. Surplus services in the same languages are often unnecessary and counterproductive. Fiscal responsibility and transparency should return to the U.S. AGM, with consolidation being a cornerstone of the strategy. As noted previously, the Open Technology Fund duplicates activities that already existed at the U.S. AGM in the Office of Internet Freedom. Numerous career whistleblowers came forward to sound the alarm to President Trump's U.S. AGM political team about OTF's abuse and overreach. Its opaque, expensive, and unnecessary usurpation of an existing U.S. AGM office is an egregious example of government waste and illustrates the general disdain for U.S. taxpayers that is rife within this agency. Full reinstatement of OIF would allow full agency and congressional oversight into how so-called Internet freedom money is being spent. J-1 visa program abuses. Rather than use the appropriate one visa intended for foreign journalists, the U.S. AGM uses the J-1 cultural exchange visas to allow foreign nationals to transition easily into jobs that American citizens with cultural and linguistic expertise could satisfy. The J-1 visa is intended for cultural and academic exchange programs, among others, none of which include journalism. Additionally, J-1 visas are meant for non-immigrant temporary exchanges. The U.S. AGM's J-1 visa holders often go on to apply for permanent residency, which violates the intention of this visa. Shortwave transmission upgrades and improvements. Non-web-based technologies that are proven and durable, such as shortwave radio transmission stations, have been grossly de-emphasized in budgeting in favor of newer web-based technologies. The move is dangerously short-sighted and puts the U.S. at a perilous strategic disadvantage in the event of a major conflict, particularly with Russia or China. There is great concern about the vulnerability of undersea cable trunks that make up the internet cloud. The vast majority of global internet traffic, 95%, is transmitted through these cables, including news transmissions, and web-based content produced by the US AGM's broadcast networks. While the robust and popular use of the internet is ideal during peacetime, during times of major conflict, widespread damage to the undersea cables that carry communications across the globe can reasonably be expected. Long-lasting power outages are also likely, such as those Ukraine experienced in the aftermath of Russia's 2022 invasion. The US AGM's responsibility for the only US global shortwave radio capability is of critical strategic importance if America is to carry its message to people seeking information and freedom within conflict zones. Shortwave technologies also make it possible to carry broadcasts in areas where internet traffic is severely restricted, as it is in many authoritarian states today. Organizational issues. Personnel. Personnel is one of the biggest concerns for the US AGM and its grantees. Attracting talented staff who will stay and letting go of poorly performing personnel are hurdles. Additionally, whistleblowers have come forward with numerous credible allegations of illegal nepotism and improper hiring practices. Past agency leaders have ignored national security procedures when hiring and have failed to adequately vet staff. Government hiring policies and federal law must be followed, and serious policy changes must be implemented to end these practices. Relevant government entities. The White House. As an executive branch agency, the US AGM ostensibly should report to the President and coordinate activities with the National Security Council, NSC, especially given the direct and implied national security aspects of the agency's messaging globally. However, there currently is no specific office in the White House or NSC liaison for the US AGM. The original network, VOA, functioned under the Office of Coordinator of Information as early as 1941, the War Department's Office of War Information from 1942 to 1945, the State Department from 1945 to 1953, and the U.S. Information Agency from 1953 until the creation of the Independent Broadcasting Board of Governors in 1999. Although some oversight and management functions of the agency are provided by the State Department, the U.S. AGM otherwise has little connectivity to larger departments or agencies, and even less to the White House. With the dissolution of the U.S. Information Agency in 1999, the U.S. AGM has virtually been under its own supervision and guidance. The results have been dismal. And as usual, there's no citation for that line. They just pronounce it dismal. It just is, darn it. The State Department. VOA was most effective before and during the Cold War, when it was under the direct supervision and control of the War and State Departments, respectively. If VOA is not put in the direct chain of command under the NSC, serious consideration should be given to putting VOA under the direct supervision of the Office of Global Public Affairs at the Department of State. The Office of Global Public Affairs was formed during the Trump administration by consolidation of the State Department's Bureau of International Information Programs and Bureau of Global Public Affairs. Ensuring that taxpayer-funded TV, radio, and messaging tells America's story is imperative and should be coordinated with the existing foreign language social media platforms at the State Department. Currently, VOA's foreign language TV programming is unreliable in telling America's story, given its amorphous interpretation of its independence firewall and its waning adherence to certain provisions of the Smith-Mundt Act, depending on which political party is in office. The VOA firewall is meant to protect broadcasters from government interference with content. However, US AGM staff have abused the firewall and used it as an offensive measure to block oversight. Additionally, the Smith-Mundt Act stipulates that US AGM services are meant to tell the American story abroad, never to domestic audiences, but the agency has used its taxpayer funding to promote partisan messaging in the US. One of the most egregious examples was when, in 2020, it bought ads on its foreign language social media sites to disseminate a Biden campaign ad and targeted it to a major Muslim population in Michigan. Moreover, VOA often airs foreign adversaries' propaganda, which is antithetical to its congressionally mandated core mission. State Department oversight, or command, may be one way to ensure that VOA and the rest of US AGM returns and adheres to its original mission. Well, that's quite a fudge, because remember VOA was pointing out that a, quote, US ally, Viktor Orban, was doing horrible things, and Project 2025 doesn't like it. That's what they're twisting into breaking their mission. Clear lines of command and communications between the US AGM and an appropriate office of the National Security Council are also sorely lacking, as has been any reasonable accountability for US AGM senior leadership and strategy. The State Department's Assistant Secretary for Global Public Affairs and Undersecretary for Diplomacy and Public Affairs should also be in the accountability loop for agency actions. While the U.S. Secretary of State technically has a seat on the board of the agency, it is a toothless seat that is often deferred to the Undersecretary and/or Assistant Secretaries noted above. This position should be relevant and directive when U.S. foreign policy and strategic communications are at stake. For example, the years-long delay in confirming the Trump-appointed CEO left disastrous holdover leadership from the previous administration. Employing effective leadership, even in an acting capacity, while a new CEO is awaiting Senate confirmation, is necessary to prevent a repeat of this behavior. Congress. The US AGM receives its budget and mandates directly from Congress. Often, changes in major functions at the agency happen because of the lobbying efforts of a few connected individuals, often grantees lobbying for more funds and less accountability. Those changes can and do handcuff leadership from any meaningful oversight. An overhaul of the agency with review from Congress to modernize, streamline, and reduce waste must be done with congressional support. Key non-governmental stakeholders, allies, and non-allies. These include industry groups, nonprofits, trade associations, foundations, and activist organizations, for example, America First Legal Foundation, US AGM Watch, BBG-US AGM Watch, and Whistleblower Protection Project. Conclusion. The US AGM is a story of a lost opportunity, both to help restore the world's confidence in the promise and ideals of America, and to set a high mark for journalistic integrity and unbiased reporting. These two areas have suffered severely under 2 decades of US AGM mismanagement and lack of oversight. Finding solutions to these problems and the restoration of the agency's networks must be the priorities of future agency leadership. To accomplish this, the US AGM must be fully reformed top to bottom, with congressional and White House support. The possibility of consolidating not only the agency's subparts, but bringing the entire agency under the supervision of the NSC, the State Department, or both would dramatically aid that reform. If the de facto aim of the agency simply remains to compete in foreign markets using anti-US talking points that parrot America's adversaries' propaganda, then this represents an unacceptable burden to the US taxpayer and a negative return on investment. In that case, the US AGM should be defunded and disestablished. If, however, the agency can be reformed to become an effective tool, it would be one of the greatest tools in America's arsenal to tell America's story and promote freedom and democracy around the world. Author's note: the preparation of this chapter was a collective effort involving many individuals to whom thanks is owed. These individuals include, but are not limited to, Victoria Coates, Michael Pack, Frank Wuko, and several brave whistleblowers who prefer not to be named. Their efforts were integral to the chapter and are greatly appreciated. Boy, conservatives hate whistleblowers when they point out horrible things they're doing, but they love whistleblowers when they're saying their opponents are doing bad things. More than a little hypocritical, don't you think? Alright, I'm going to take a sip of today's beverage here before we go into the next section. A little bourbon with some Honeycrisp apple kombucha and sparkling water. Corporation for Public Broadcasting by Mike Gonzalez. Every Republican president since Richard Nixon has tried to strip the Corporation for Public Broadcasting of taxpayer funding. That is significant not just because it means that for half a century, Republican presidents have failed to accomplish what they set out to do, but also because Nixon was the first president in office when NPR and PBS, which the CPB funds, went on air. In other words, all Republican presidents have recognized that public funding of domestic broadcast is a mistake. I wouldn't use the word recognize there, more like think it's a mistake, because they know an educated populace is less likely to fall for their nonsense. As a 35-year-old lawyer in the Nixon White House, one Antonin Scalia warned that conservatives were being confronted with a long-range problem of significant social consequences, that is, the development of a government-funded broadcast system similar to the BBC. All of which means that the next conservative president must finally get this done, and do it, despite opposition from congressional members of his own party, if necessary. To stop public funding is good policy and good politics. The reason is simple. President Lyndon Johnson may have pledged in 1967 that public broadcasting would become a vital public resource to enrich our homes, educate our families, and to provide assistance to our classrooms. But public broadcasting immediately became a liberal forum for public affairs and journalism. Not only is the federal government trillions of dollars in debt and unable to afford the more than $500 million squandered on leftist opinion every year, but the government should not be compelling the conservative half of the country to pay for the suppression of its own views. As Thomas Jefferson put it, to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagations of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. A demonstrated pattern of bias. Conservatives will thus reward a president who eliminates this tyrannical situation. PBS and NPR do not even bother to run programming that would attract conservatives. As Pew Research demonstrated in 2014, 25% of PBS's audience is mostly liberal, and 35% is consistently liberal. That is 60% liberal, compared to 15% conservative, 11% mostly conservative, and 4% consistently conservative. NPR's audience is even to the left of that, with 67% liberal, 41% consistently liberal, and 26% mostly liberal, compared with 12% conservative, 3%, and 9% consistently conservative and mostly conservative, respectively. That may be an acceptable business model for MSNBC or CNN, but not for a taxpayer-subsidized broadcaster. Or maybe conservatives are too stupid to understand the concepts being put forth on PBS and NPR? So that's why they don't watch or listen? Just a thought. When I worked in rock radio, we started seeing ratings going down overall, not just, the station I was at, but other stations in the market. It wasn't because we weren't serving the right rock audience, it's just less people were enjoying rock music. But I digress. Defunding through the budgetary process. Cutting off the CPB is logistically easy. The solution lies in the budgetary process. In 2022, the CPB submitted to the Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and related agencies subcommittees of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees its budget justification for fiscal year 2023. In it, the CPB requested that Congress give it a $565 million advance appropriation, a $40 million increase compared to its fiscal year 2022 funding. Unlike most other agencies, the CPB receives advanced appropriations that provide them with funding 2 years ahead of time, which insulates the agency from Congress's power of the purse and oversight. This special budgetary treatment is unjustified and should be ended. The 47th president can just tell Congress, through the budget he proposes and through personal contact, that he will not sign an appropriation spending bill that contains a penny for the CPB. The president may have to use the bully pulpit, as NPR and PBS have teams of lobbyists who have convinced enough members of Congress to save their bacon every time their taxpayer subsidies have been at risk since the Nixon era. Defunding CPB would by no means cause NPR or PBS or other public broadcasters that benefit from CPB funding, including the even further to the left Pacifica Radio and American Public Media, to file for bankruptcy. The membership model that CPB uses, along with the funding from corporations and foundations that it also receives, would allow these broadcasters to continue to thrive. As George Will wrote, if Sesame Street programming were put up for auction, the danger would be of getting trampled by the stampede of potential bidders. Indeed, Sesame Street is on HBO now, which shows its potential as a money earner. Public interest versus privilege. Stripping public funding would, of course, mean that NPR, PBS, Pacifica Radio, and the other leftist broadcasters would be shorn of the presumption that they act in the public interest and receive the privileges that often accompany so acting. They should no longer, for example, be qualified as non-commercial education stations, NCE stations, which they clearly no longer are. NPR, Pacifica, and the other radio ventures have zero claim on an educational function, the original purpose for which they were created by President Johnson. And the percentage of on-air programming that PBS devotes to educational endeavors such as Sesame Street, programs that are themselves biased to the left, is small. Being an NCE comes with benefits. The Federal Communications Commission, for example, reserves the 20 stations at the lower end of the radio frequency between 88 and 108 megahertz on the FM band for NCEs. The FCC says that only non-commercial educational radio stations are licensed in the 88 to 92 megahertz reserved band, while both commercial and non-commercial educational stations may operate in the non-reserved band. This confers advantages, as lower frequency stations can be heard farther away and are easier to find as they lie on the left end of the radio dial, figuratively as well as ideologically. They couldn't resist, they couldn't leave it to the reader to make their own terrible conservative-leaning joke. The FCC also exempts NCE stations from licensing fees. It says that non-commercial educational NCE FM station licensees and full-service NCE television broadcast station licensees are exempt from paying regulatory fees, provided that these stations operate solely on an NCE basis. NPR and PBS stations are in reality no longer non-commercial, as they run ads in everything but name for their sponsors. They are also non-educational. The next president should instruct the FCC to exclude the stations affiliated with PBS and NPR from the NCE denomination and the privileges that come with it. And then we go into end notes. They hate any kind of education which teaches people how to get along. They despise it. And they've been going after NPR and PBS for decades now. It's really sickening. I'm going to take a break here. The next section looks pretty thick. It's called Agency for International Development by Max Primorak. This recording and all other recordings related to this Project 2025 reading are copyrighted by Douglas Wayne Ricketts. All rights reserved. Unless you agree with me that Project 2025 sucks, then please feel free to use as much of this reading as you want. Thanks for listening.